Empires have been around for a long, long time. From the Hittites to the Romans, the Soviets and the Americans, the Persians and the Qing, or even the Inca all the way in the mountains of Peru. Imperialism is just about the next logical step to, hey, we should stay here and settle it for food, because other people now want to do that. These states have been a constant in my videos, as well as in real life, for a reason. These great assemblies of power and prestige have shaped our understanding of the world in ways that we can't really fathom today. And being that about half of my videos have been asking what if a certain empire was even bigger, I thought exploring some of the imperial projects that have captured my interest the most would be a fun and different sort of video for this week. This isn't rating them by power or anything, more or less just, hey, here's a bunch of stuff I think is neat, and why it's more neat than this other stuff. We'll also dabble in what I would do in a video about them in some form or another. Also, all of these nations and empires, by their nature, were utterly vile for the vast majority of their subjects, and all of them were guilty of what we would now call genocide and crimes against humanity. So this video isn't meant to be imperial apologism, nor do I want to see any of that in the comments. But with that out of the way, let's get right into it. Number 10, the Ottoman Empire. Anatolia might be the most strategically important part of the world before the Age of Exploration, and most of ancient and classical history was tied in some part to controlling the Middle East. The Ottomans got their start with the collapse of the Seljuk Khanate and eventually rose to be the preeminent Middle Eastern power, with lands as far as Morocco pledging tribute to them, and like all empires centered around the Aegean Sea, had quite a bit of beef with the various Persian dynasties. The main thing that captures my interest, though, is their role in European politics. Their rivalries with Austria and Russia during the 18th century, obviously, in addition to the Franco-Ottoman alliance, due to Paris's other rivalries. The Ottomans, perhaps more than any other factor, forced Europe to widen its diplomatic horizons and push it into the world writ large. The Ottomans were also very close to reform and success throughout the entire 19th century. They had plenty of resources and had good relations with all three of Britain, France, and Germany, while their enemies were the also struggling Russians and Austria. The reasons for their decline are almost entirely internal. They were still the bane of Europe even after the Poles rescued Austria at Vienna, but after the Janissaries amassed too much political power and Napoleon invaded Egypt, this led to the deposing of Selim III, which threw the course of reform off for the next several decades. And by that point, they were too far behind the rest of the West and required the support of Britain and France to even survive. So, at least we know where to go for a fix-it video. Number 9, Brazil. The Brazilian Empire is one of two alternate history scenarios that exist for the entire continent of South America, since it's easy to draw the correlation that since everything sucked after Pedro was deposed, they wouldn't suck if he wasn't. In addition, Brazil's status as the largest and most populated country in South America, as well as a perennial country of the future reputation, makes it a very tempting question. The Brazilian Empire got its start after Napoleon deposed the Portuguese monarchy and exiled them to South America, wherein the king realized that he liked the tropical and sunny part of his empire where chocolate and gold were days away, more than he liked the tiny rainy part where those things took weeks to get. So he declared that he was only king of the nice bit, and to rub salt in the wound, made it an empire. Of course, once you start digging in, you also realize that the empire was not nearly as perfect as Pedro's personal skills would have you believe. I've actually already done a video about this. It's one of the last ones done on MS Paint, thank fuck. And it talks about how you need to drastically increase the Brazilian population and effectively end slavery a lot sooner than the country did historically. These were the dominating factors that led to café com leite politics, wherein the two largest agricultural industries dominated the First Republic until Vargas came along and said that he would dominate the Republic. Of course, actually fixing those things is easier said than done, but that's what the other video's for, not this one. Number 8, Revolutionary France. Come on, do I need to explain this one? Napoleonic France was that motherfucker, and it dominated Europe. Everything from the chaos of the First Republic and messy politics to kicking Europe's collective ass. In addition, there's something tragic about the whole revolution, from the well-intentioned king not being forceful enough to create the reforms that would save his kingdom, to the angry and oppressed people rising up in a blaze of liberation only to fall into their own despotism and sidelining of Republican values, only to be stabilized by a middling nobleman who dominated Europe and fell from his height of power in a hubristic invasion of Russia and Spain. Now, saving revolutionary France is an odd question, since saving the First Republic is very different from saving the Napoleonic Empire. Not to mention, the fact of it is, Napoleon is both the X factor and its biggest weakness, meaning that just getting rid of him won't necessarily save the Republic, and killing him early would probably just doom his empire more than anything. As a result, there's no real clean way to do it, especially since it was up against Britain, which has almost every economic advantage it could possibly want at this point. Number 7, the Spanish Empire. In case it's not obvious, I love the Age of Exploration and Industrial Revolution compared to most other parts of history, and Spain was just as foundational to that as the Ottomans were. Actually, to be entirely fair, it was more so since it actually did the Age of Exploration. Emerging from the Reconquista right in time for the Turks to block the Silk Road, they would go on to conquer most of the New World and inherit about half of Europe. However, this Edad de Oro would only last a century before they began to atrophy under the weight of their foreign obligations and having so much gold that it literally became worthless. However, up until the War of Spanish Succession, they were still a leading power of Europe, and even after it, they were a solid number 4. However, with the French Revolution, they were smacked around by France and effectively Napoleon's satellite, until he betrayed them, and then they were a massive insurgency at the cost of their empire. They're a lot harder to save in alternate histories that have the French Revolution and Napoleon, since the entire empire kind of exploded over the subsequent 30 years, and it became an impossible task to save more than a few colonies. But if we were to do it, we'd absolutely need to stabilize and improve their economy in the aftermath of the War of Spanish Succession and change the Bourbon reforms. We also need to eliminate Ferdinand's coup against his father. Neither of them were good kings, but the coup and subsequent civil war were how Napoleon was able to get into Spain and cause it to lose control over the colonies, thus dooming the empire no matter what happened. Number 6. The Holy Roman Empire. Specifically the German version that Otto founded in 962. As much as I bully it in my videos, the Holy Roman Empire was easily the most powerful state in Europe from the 960s to the 1300s, and its decline was one of the longest and most drawn-out affairs in European history. Born from a dream of Rome, the HRE was able to dominate the continent for quite a while, controlling lands as far as Belgium and Sicily and into Poland, with nominal supremacy over all of Europe. However, that very size is what led to the power of the nobles. Starting with the 20-year interregnum from the 1250s to the 1270s, the elections were consistently contested with wars and conflict, leaving the eventual victor increasingly weakened. This would continue on for a century until the rise of Sigismund of Luxembourg, who tied the state to Hungary, a practice continued by the Habsburgs who supplanted him. And even then, this empire would survive. In fact, from the 1400s to the 1600s, like much of Europe, it was going through a period of relative centralization and the reinvigoration of royal or imperial power, facilitated by the de facto primogeniture of the Habsburg dynasty. However, with the rise of Protestantism all over Germany and Europe as a whole, stoking 100 years of war, and allowing the rise of Prussia, the HRE was left exhausted and Austria turned toward the Balkans for power and wealth, leaving the HRE to lag behind other powers like France and Britain until Napoleon finally put it out of its misery. Also, while we're here, fuck Voltaire, the HRE was a victim of atrophy in the evolution of language. The Holy Roman Empire was named as such for a few reasons. Namely, it was wholly due to the fact that for the first 568 years, the emperor had to be crowned by the Pope, which eventually did become another long-term destabilization that led to the loss of Italy. But Roman was the more interesting quirk of the name. See, in the European mindset of the 900s, Rome was the only empire, and no normal king could ever compete with it. Which, to be fair, is probably historically accurate. But that gave the name Rome a sense of superiority as well as a spiritual invocation. In effect, it wasn't a literal statement of being the new Rome, but the papacy was saying that as a Roman institution, it had the power to say that the Ottonian Empire was as great as Rome. The use of empire is similar and the easiest to justify. It was a combination of multiple kingdoms under one legal authority. The Holy Roman Emperor was also the king of Germany, Italy, and Burgundy. In addition, after the Hussite revolt, they became the overlord to the kingdom of Bohemia within the empire. And now they have to be an emperor because that's the only title bigger than a king. Saving the HRE probably requires going, at least, as far back as the 1600s with the rise of Protestantism. The Habsburgs, early on, tried to be about as tolerant of the sect as they could be for a dynasty and title literally crowned by the Pope, which was allowing their vassals and the lords in each fiefdom to choose the faith of their province, but once war started over Bohemia, all hell broke loose. Germany lost over a third of its population, leaving almost all of it devastated for decades. In addition, the contemporary 80 Years' War kicked off, and while the Netherlands were administered by the Crown of Spain, they were some of the best ports to trade with for your average German merchant, meaning that the consistent violence would still have knock-on effects. But if one is to successfully save said empire, they'd more or less have Germany centuries earlier, which could possibly make it even more overpowered. Number 5. The Mongols. The biggest and baddest land empire to ever exist, the Mongols are a very nice dividing point between the early Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages. From their conquest in China all the way to Poland, they brought down states as powerful as China, kneecapped the Seljuks, leaving the vacuum the Ottomans would later exploit, and causing centuries of change throughout the old world. Genghis Khan's emphasis on meritocracy and total war brought about a level of power unseen in any nomadic empire before or since, with his children ruling as kings in Persia, Russia, and China alike. Hell, some even attribute the end of feudalism to the Mongols via the Black Death. The Mongols fractured more or less due to their own success, since it effectively got so big that it couldn't elect a new Khan quickly enough. As a result, a scant 80 years after it formed, it had effectively broken down into 4 new states. The Chagatai Khanate that everyone forgets about, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Il Khanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty of China. Each of them declined in distinct ways from the other, and because of how the Mongols fractured, I almost feel like saving them might require making them smaller, which is boring. So we'll have to save that for another time. Number 4, the Angevin Empire. So this one is blatantly cheating, and the people who lived in it wouldn't have called it an empire at the time, but it's my list, and as we have established, I like medieval history. Regardless, the Angevin Empire was the dynastic hobbling of the Angevin dynasty all across Western Europe. Tributes in Scotland and Ireland, the entire Kingdom of England, and about half of France. Since the 1066 Norman Conquest, the kings of England and the various dynasties therein had consistently been inheriting bits and pieces of France, usually Normandy, and getting into fistfights with the King of France about it. The Angevin Empire was the absolute height of this trend, and they wouldn't match it until they absolutely walloped Charles VI in the 100 Years' War. Indeed, this isn't even the actual 100 Years' War, at least not the one you learn about as the 100 Years' War. You could reasonably say that there were 3 periods that fit that title. From 1150 to 1250 during the rise of the Angevins and their constant meddling in Paris, the second 100 Years' War being the attempt at unification, and the third 100 Years' War being from 1715 to 1815. Please note, I'm not a historian, and I've rarely seen anyone actually use both modes of periodization to turn all three into 100 Years' Wars. But my point is, England and France fight a lot. Regardless, the Angevins were more or less doomed from the start unless they were able to conquer France properly. Because it was a patchwork of various duchies and tributaries that fell under different monarchies, these lands weren't actually passed down from one son to another, and after Richard the Lionheart's death, the empire was bankrupt and France was able to seize much of the French portion of the empire, leaving John unable to afford another invasion without taxing the nobles, but he sucked, so they forced him to sign Magna Carta, and now we have a parliament. So next time you feel bad about something, at least they don't totally restructure the company because of how much you suck. Honorable mentions. What kind of top 10 doesn't have some shameless padding for content after all? But yeah, these are countries and empires I like learning about or am interested in, but for some reason or another, they just didn't make the cut or vibe with the rest of the list. The Byzantines. Like I said in the Persia video, I don't really like pre-medieval stuff, and that unfortunately includes most of the Roman Empire. I like history through a how we got here lens, and while I see the connective tissue through Rome in the modern day, you'd have to be stupid to not, it just doesn't capture my interest. However, the Byzantines are much more interesting because of their connections to the Ottomans and the HRE. Still not my favorite, but it didn't feel right leaving Rome off here entirely. Next, the Habsburg monarchy. To be honest, I just have a soft spot for the Habsburgs. They pop up everywhere, marry everyone, kinda suck at war, but they're just so damn persistent that it's charming. The main reason they're an honorable mention is that I don't know how much you can separate their relative zenith from either Spain or the HRE. And in fact, they're already kind of on here twice, and a third just wouldn't feel fair. The Kalmar Union is another dynastic empire, but the Union of Kalmar was a 1300s treaty that attempted to unify all of Scandinavia under one crown to secure their peace. It kind of worked for a while, but wound up dominated by the Danes. In addition, they all had independent elective monarchies, they just agreed to elect the same person. So, does this count? Like, it held out for a while, and Denmark maintained control over Norway for centuries after the whole thing, but is this an empire? I want it to be. And before we wrap up the list, if you've enjoyed the video so far, please consider like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and lets you stay notified of future releases. Thank you, and let's get right back to the show. Number 3, the Carolingian Empire, or Francia, the quintessential medieval empire. Stretching from Brittany to Austria, the Frankish Empire was the closest we ever got to a restoration of Western Rome. While the Merovingians would be the royal house that more or less cemented Frankish control over Gaul, it would be Charles Martel who would prevent Moorish invasion in the south, and his son, Charles the Great, would expand the empire in all directions, fighting just about everyone he laid eyes on. Except for when he was ushering in the first Renaissance after the fall of the West, by being a patron of the arts and creating lowercase and uppercase letters, and generally making literacy happen. So, why did it die? Well, you know how I said the Angevin Empire was doomed due to messy internal succession? Well, this is more of the same. When Charlemagne kicked it, he only had one son, Louis the Pious. But Louis had 3 sons who each had to be given a kingdom. And while the oldest Lothair was nominally the emperor, he was also clearly Dad's least favorite child. Because while his brothers, Louis and Charles, got actual cohesive states, Lothair got the Rhine River Basin and Italy. Now, to be fair, Italy was necessary for him to actually be the legitimate emperor. It ties back to the earlier stuff about the HRE. But at the same time, just give the guy some land in southern Gaul. Don't do this. Keeping the Franks united isn't actually that easy either. Sure, we can have Lothair get an actually viable kingdom and keep his brothers in line, but eventually someone's going to have too many sons and the kingdoms will disintegrate. And at that point, it won't necessarily be in a recognizable way. Bavaria could wind up separated from Germany for a lot longer than it ever was in our timeline, for example, and that's if it doesn't expand in the slightest, which would be a tad unlikely in this situation. Number 2, the Portuguese Empire. So, fun fact, I have family from the Azores, these Portuguese islands. Is that the only reason I think the Portuguese Empire is neat? No. Is it probably the reason I like them better than the Dutch? Yes. Regardless, Portugal, like Spain, stepped onto the world stage during the Age of Exploration, kickstarting the process by sailing around West Africa. From there, they would set up trading posts all over the world and get fabulously wealthy as a result, buying up land in Africa and Asia, from Angola to the East Indies. Hell, some even argue they discovered Brazil before Columbus found the Caribbean. So yeah, Portugal is here because this tiny little rump kingdom on the ass end of Europe managed to control all of this with money and boats it could only afford because of the stuff it already had. I think they call that a pyramid scheme now, actually. However, they were also one of, if not the most prolific slavers in the entire era, considering everything with Brazil, so they lose a lot of points here. But now we have to ask, what killed it? Well, one could make the argument that it was Napoleon that knocked them out of the top 5, but frankly he's already killed 2 other empires on this list, 3 if we count his own, so I'm not going to. Instead, I'm going to blame the Iberian Union when Felipe II inherited Portugal. While this made him king of fucking everything, it also screwed over Portugal, since they were now at war with everyone. In addition, Spain used their resources for these wars, and Portugal couldn't use any of Spain's wealth and power to further their own ends. which is oddly karmic now that I think about it, so you know what, maybe they deserved it. Saving Portugal is thus relatively easy. It would mostly mean avoiding the Iberian Union, so Sebastian I has to live. Of course, then we need Portugal to embrace a very modern economics and look out in places like India and Indonesia, both of which it failed at in real life, but that's beside the point. Number 1. Britain. Okay, yeah, I know. The only choice more basic than Rome. Okay, look, we all know about the rise of the British Empire. From the Spanish Armada and the founding of Jamestown to the conquest of India and the scramble for Africa. Hell, we've kind of covered a lot of that history here. They ruled the fucking planet from 1763 to 1910, and that's not even a comment on their power or anything, they just geographically were the most widespread empire of all time, and it shows. From Elizabeth to George, they were getting all over everything. Of course, that also means they were doing terrible things all over and were among the most prolific slavers before they abolished the practice, and suddenly labor conditions in India were even worse than before, and now there's a larger presence of Indian workers in East Africa arriving throughout the entire 19th century. Even if things like the Industrial Revolution, the liberalization of the 17th to 1800s, hell, even the Opium Wars are always fascinating to learn about. The decline of the British Empire honestly has less to do with their decisions or internal problems, and more due to other powers getting dealt a better hand. In terms of raw industry, Germany outclassed them by the 1890s, and the US did it by 1910. Dead to rights, Britain's main strength after that was inertia, and that's not insurmountable. Thus, by fighting the two deadliest wars in human history, Britain just exhausted itself and was left to the schemes and machinations of the two new superpowers, who both agreed that Britain had to go home. And no, I'm not saving the British Empire. It is a very solid contender for the most evil entity on this list, and very likely in world history. Is that moralizing, especially after everything else we talked about? Probably, but it's the most recent one on the list, so it's more relevant to moralize about it. But that is the list. This is a little different than my normal videos, since this is just me talking about some stuff I think is neat with a vague connective thread, but after some burnout last week, I thought this might be easier than a full-on video. We'll see if I stand by that. Before we go, I want to give a quick thank you to channel members Nafumato, Grimwalt, and Dubsmain, and a special thank you to Dubsmain and Grimwalt for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you so much for watching, and join me next time to explore another alternate world.